Some loves do not break loudly. They do not shatter with betrayal or cruelty. They end quietly, through hesitation, timing, and the weight of choices made too early by hearts that had not yet learned how to fight for themselves. Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June did not fall in love the way stories often exaggerated. There were no dramatic declarations, no reckless promises. Their connection grew in subtle, disciplined ways, through shared silences, exchanged glances that lingered longer than necessary, and the quiet understanding that formed when two people recognized something familiar in each other long before they had language for it. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. They were young but not careless. Their world was structured, ambitious, and guided by expectations that did not leave much room for uncertainty. Bryan was already shaped by discipline, raised with the understanding that control and restraint were currencies more valuable than emotion. Elizabeth, equally sharp and observant, carried an elegance that did not come from wealth alone but from self-awareness far beyond her age. What they shared was restrained, almost ceremonial. It existed in moments stolen between obligations, in the gravity of their attention toward each other rather than physical closeness. It was the kind of love that sharpened awareness instead of dulling it. The kind that made them notice the future pressing in too soon. They knew, without ever articulating it, that the timing was wrong. The world around them moved with speed and expectation. Paths were being drawn for them by parents, institutions, and futures already mapped in ink. Bryan was expected to rise, to focus, to mold himself into something formidable and untouchable. Elizabeth was expected to become accomplished, composed, and independent, never reckless with her heart. What neither of them expected was how deeply the absence of action could wound. Their connection lived in restraint, and restraint eventually became its undoing. Because nothing dramatic tore them apart, nothing heroic kept them together either. The end came quietly, like a door closing without a sound. One moment they were part of each other's emotional landscape, and the next they were not. No promises were broken because none had been spoken. No arguments burned bridges. The relationship dissolved into distance, into unreturned messages that grew farther apart, into opportunities taken in different directions. It ended not because love disappeared, but because courage had not yet arrived. And that was the cruelty of it. Years later, neither Bryan nor Elizabeth would remember the exact day it ended. There was no timestamp for loss like that. Only a lingering awareness that something unfinished had been left behind, something unresolved enough to follow them forward into adulthood. For Bryan, the end became a lesson in control. He learned how to compartmentalize emotion, how to turn longing into ambition, how to build a life that looked powerful enough to silence regret. He did everything expected of him and more. Yet, beneath the polish of success, something remained suspended, an emotional thread he never quite cut. Elizabeth carried the ending differently. She absorbed it, reflected on it, and transformed it into growth. She learned how to stand alone without bitterness, how to love deeply without clinging. Still, even as she evolved into a woman of confidence and composure, she carried the quiet imprint of a boy who had once seen her fully, and left without ever truly saying goodbye. Neither of them spoke about it in later years. Their friends knew fragments, never the full weight. It was easier to treat it as something youthful, something outgrown. But certain loves do not diminish with time, they simply change shape. The tragedy was not that they lost each other. It was that they lost each other before they ever had the chance to choose each other as adults. Because what they shared had not been reckless or fleeting. It had been deliberate, restrained, and full of potential that went unexplored. It had ended too soon, not at its peak but before it was allowed to mature into something undeniable. And so they moved on. At least that was what it looked like from the outside. But the truth lingered quietly beneath every future relationship, every comparison made unconsciously, every moment of hesitation when something felt almost right, but not quite enough. What they did not know then was that unfinished love does not disappear. It waits. Time did what it always promised to do. It moved forward without mercy, carrying Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June into lives that appeared complete on the surface. Distance did not erase what had been left unfinished. It merely buried it beneath routine, achievement, and the steady accumulation of adult responsibilities. Bryan's life unfolded with precision. He stepped into environments defined by influence, capital, and quiet authority, spaces where decisions shaped outcomes far beyond the room. His discipline hardened into reputation. Control became instinct. He learned how to command respect without raising his voice, how to dominate negotiations with restraint rather than force. From the outside, his life read like success refined, measured growth, strategic relationships, and an emotional reserve that made him seem untouchable. Yet even as his world expanded, something remained conspicuously absent. Relationships came and went, each one orderly, each one lacking the depth he could never quite articulate. There was always a moment, sometimes early, sometimes late, when he realized he was present but not fully invested. Affection existed, attraction too, but connection never rooted itself deeply enough to stay. He told himself it was preference, standards, maturity. He told himself many things. What he never told himself was the truth, that somewhere in his emotional memory lived a version of love that nothing else managed to reach. Elizabeth's life evolved along a different rhythm. She became deliberate, self-possessed, and quietly formidable. Her confidence was not loud, it was assured. She built a life defined by independence and emotional clarity, learning how to want without needing and how to love without losing herself. She attracted admiration easily, but she guarded intimacy carefully. Her relationships were thoughtful but cautious. She was never reckless with her heart, never impulsive. Each experience refined her understanding of what she deserved. Still, despite growth and fulfillment, there remained a subtle ache, one she rarely acknowledged but never fully escaped. Every now and then, in moments of stillness, she would feel it, the awareness of something unresolved, something that had shaped her capacity to feel deeply without ever completing its arc. They did not think of each other constantly. That would have been too obvious, too indulgent. Instead, the memories surfaced unexpectedly, through comparisons never spoken aloud, through the quiet disappointment of realizing that intimacy could exist without emotional resonance. It was not longing in the traditional sense, it was recognition without presence. Bryan occasionally caught himself recalling details that no longer had context. A way of listening. A shared silence that never felt empty. The understanding that once existed without explanation. He would dismiss it quickly, returning to the structure of his life, to ambition and control. Yet the recollection always left a faint imprint, subtle but undeniable. Elizabeth experienced it differently. Her memories were less intrusive, more reflective. They came during moments of introspection, when she measured how far she had come and quietly acknowledged the version of herself that had loved without armor. She did not regret that love, nor did she romanticize it. She simply accepted that it had existed, and that it had ended before it had the chance to mature. What neither of them realized was how parallel their emotional landscapes had become. They were both fulfilled yet not settled. Accomplished yet not complete. They had grown into adults capable of choosing wisely, yet neither had encountered a connection that demanded the same level of emotional surrender as the one they had abandoned too early. Their worlds remained separate, intersecting only through faint traces of mutual acquaintances and distant updates that carried no real substance. Names appeared occasionally, unremarkable and easily ignored. There was no intention behind the distance, only habit and the belief that some chapters were meant to stay closed. But unresolved endings do not dissolve. They mature quietly, waiting for the moment when time, growth, and circumstance align. Elizabeth's life was stable, thoughtfully curated. Bryan's was powerful, meticulously controlled. Both were moving forward, yet neither had fully escaped the gravitational pull of what had been left undone. What they did not know, what neither of them could have predicted, was that the very separation they believed had protected them had only delayed the inevitable reckoning. That growth had not erased their connection, only refined it. And that the ache they carried so quietly was not a weakness but a signal. Because some loves do not fade with distance. They sharpen. And when the right moment arrives, they demand to be acknowledged, not as memories but as possibilities reborn. Nothing in life announces itself as fate. It usually arrives disguised as coincidence, wrapped in harmless intention, moving quietly through people who have no idea they are about to alter the course of someone else's carefully ordered world. Haley Short did not see herself as a catalyst. She was practical, observant, and deeply loyal, especially to Elizabeth June. She understood Elizabeth's restraint, her independence, and the way she guarded her private life with quiet precision. Over the years, Haley had watched her friend grow into a woman admired by many yet truly known by few. She respected that balance, never pushing, never probing too deeply. When Haley reconnected with Richard Saint, it felt natural rather than calculated. Their bond had always existed on an easy rhythm. Shared history, mutual respect, and a familiarity that required no explanation. Richard had matured into someone composed and confident, shaped by experience rather than ego. Their renewed friendship unfolded effortlessly, catching up on years without revisiting what had been lost or gained. Through Richard, Haley became aware of Bryan Cool again, not as a memory from Elizabeth's past, but as a man fully formed in the present. Richard spoke of him without embellishment, describing a friend whose life was structured, powerful, and deliberate. There was no nostalgia in the recounting, only acknowledgement. Bryan existed as a fact, not a story. Haley listened without suspicion. She had never fully known the depth of what Elizabeth and Bryan once shared. She knew there had been something significant, unresolved, but like many youthful connections, it had been quietly archived and left untouched. Elizabeth never dramatized it, never framed it as loss. And so Haley, respecting boundaries, never treated it as unfinished business. That was what made her decision so unguarded. The idea of a small gathering formed easily. Not an event, not a spectacle, just an intimate evening among familiar faces. A setting where people could relax without expectation, where conversation flowed without agenda. Haley extended the invitation to Elizabeth instinctively, assuming it would be a welcome break from routine. Elizabeth hesitated briefly, though not for reasons she could fully articulate. Something about the timing felt weighted, unfamiliar. But she trusted Haley. She trusted her own stability. Whatever had once existed in her past no longer held power over her present, or so she believed. Richard, for his part, suggested Bryan join just as casually. There was no persuasion involved, no underlying motive. Bryan rarely declined invitations that aligned with his schedule, and this one required no emotional investment. It was social, controlled, predictable. He agreed without hesitation. None of them framed it as a reunion. No one anticipated collision. The gathering itself was designed to be unremarkable, comfortable, understated, intentional. Haley valued environments that encouraged authenticity rather than performance. The atmosphere was curated for ease, not impression. It was the kind of space where people arrived as they were, without armor. Elizabeth prepared for the evening with her usual composure. She chose presence over spectacle, confidence over statement. Her mind was clear, her expectations minimal. There was no reason for vigilance. Bryan approached the night with the same detachment he applied to most social engagements. He anticipated polite conversation, familiar faces, nothing more. His life did not leave room for unpredictability. He had built it that way. What neither of them understood was that the invitation was not about the evening itself. It was about alignment. Time had passed. They were no longer the people who had walked away quietly years ago. They had grown into adults capable of standing in the presence of unfinished truths without collapsing under their weight. The world they were about to re-enter together was not one of memory, but of possibility. Haley, unaware of the role she was playing, moved through the final preparations with ease. She believed she was bringing together people who mattered to her. She had no sense that she was opening a door long sealed, not violently, not dramatically, but gently enough to make resistance impossible. Because some reunions do not announce themselves with urgency. They arrive softly. And when they do, they test not who people used to be, but who they have become. The evening approached with quiet inevitability, each step forward guided by decisions that felt ordinary, even forgettable. Yet beneath that ordinariness lived momentum, carefully delayed, perfectly timed. What was about to unfold would not unravel the lives Bryan and Elizabeth had built. It would challenge them to decide whether those lives had been built as shields, or as foundations for something deeper. And neither of them, moving calmly toward the same place from different directions, had any idea that the ache they had carried separately was about to recognize itself again. Not as memory, but as presence. The room did not change when Elizabeth June arrived. The lighting remained steady, the conversations continued uninterrupted, and the air held the same easy rhythm it had carried moments before. Yet something shifted all the same, something invisible but decisive, like gravity reasserting itself without warning. Elizabeth entered with composure shaped by years of self-possession. She carried herself with an ease that came from knowing who she was and what she no longer needed to prove. Her presence was refined, intentional, and unguarded. She scanned the space briefly, registering faces without attaching meaning, until her awareness caught on something unfamiliar yet profoundly known. Bryan Cool had been mid-thought when he looked up. Recognition arrived before logic. Before memory could frame itself. Before reason could intervene. It struck with a quiet force that neither of them had prepared for, not shock, not disbelief, but certainty. The kind that bypasses explanation and settles immediately into the body. Time did not slow dramatically. It did not stop. It narrowed. For a suspended moment, everything else receded, the background conversation, the movement of others, the structure of the evening. What remained was the undeniable awareness of someone who had once occupied a private, formative space now standing fully present, altered yet unmistakably the same. Elizabeth registered him in layers. The stature, the controlled stillness, the authority that no longer needed to announce itself. He had matured into something formidable not through excess but through restraint. The boy she had known had not disappeared. He had been refined, sharpened by time and intention. Bryan observed her with equal clarity. The elegance was still there, but it had deepened. Her presence carried assurance rather than uncertainty, confidence rather than caution. She was no longer becoming, she had arrived. Whatever fragility once existed had been replaced with strength that did not need to perform. Neither of them smiled immediately. This was not a casual encounter. It was not nostalgia. It was confrontation, not with each other but with the version of themselves that had once walked away quietly, believing distance would resolve what courage had not. The space between them felt charged, not with urgency, but with recognition that demanded composure. They were no longer teenagers uncertain of their footing. They were adults, capable of holding the weight of history without unraveling. Around them life continued seamlessly. Haley moved through the room unaware of the stillness she had created. Richard exchanged greetings, oblivious to the gravity settling between two people standing just close enough to feel it. Bryan rose naturally, driven less by intent than instinct. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. There was no rush toward familiarity, no retreat into distance. They existed in that narrow space between acknowledgement and restraint. The moment stretched, not awkward, not dramatic, but dense with meaning. Their shared past did not flood in all at once. Instead, it revealed itself in fragments. The memory of how easily they had once understood each other, the absence that had followed, the quiet ache carried forward into separate lives. What unsettled them most was not the memory of what had been, but the awareness of what still was. They had both changed. They had both grown. Yet the connection, though dormant, had not dissolved. It had matured beneath the surface, waiting for proximity to bring it back into focus. Elizabeth noted the discipline in Bryan's restraint, the way he neither avoided nor advanced the moment. It mirrored her own. They were meeting each other as equals now, no longer constrained by youth or uncertainty. Bryan registered the calm in Elizabeth's presence, the absence of defensiveness, the strength in her stillness. She was not bracing herself for impact. She was simply present, unafraid of what recognition might demand. Their awareness of each other settled into something quieter but more dangerous: familiarity without permission. The kind that makes denial impossible. This was not a reunion fueled by sentiment. It was an encounter shaped by evolution. As the evening continued to unfold, the initial stillness gave way to movement, yet the shift remained. They existed within the same space now, orbiting a shared awareness neither had acknowledged but both felt acutely. Nothing had been said. Nothing needed to be. The recognition had already done its work. What lay ahead was not the challenge of remembering, but the far more complex task of deciding what to do with what still lived between them, now that time, growth, and proximity had stripped away every excuse for avoidance. And for the first time in years, the ache they had carried separately had a face again. The recognition did not fade once the moment passed. It settled instead, reshaping the space around Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June in ways neither could ignore. Proximity, once incidental, became unavoidable. Movement within the room subtly aligned them again and again, not by intention, but by the quiet orchestration of circumstance and shared connections. Haley, unaware of the undercurrent she had unleashed, moved with natural ease between her guests, drawing people together in small clusters, redirecting conversations, closing gaps without suspicion. Each adjustment shortened the distance Bryan and Elizabeth had instinctively allowed themselves after recognition. What began as coincidence evolved into sustained nearness. They found themselves seated within the same conversational circle, close enough to register each other's presence without directly engaging. The air between them felt heavier now, charged not with urgency but with restraint. Every subtle shift, an angle turned, a pause held, carried awareness. Elizabeth noticed the discipline with which Bryan held himself. He was attentive but measured, present without intrusion. His restraint was not avoidance, it was intentional. It mirrored her own internal negotiation, the effort to remain composed while acknowledging the undeniable tension building beneath the surface. Bryan, for his part, remained acutely aware of Elizabeth's presence. It altered his perception of the room, narrowing his focus without his consent. He registered her movements reflexively, the cadence of her attention, the way her composure never slipped even as proximity intensified. She was calm but not detached. That distinction mattered. The conversation around them flowed easily, but neither fully absorbed it. Their attention existed on two levels: outward participation and inward awareness. The juxtaposition created a controlled friction, one that demanded discipline to maintain. What unsettled them both was the absence of discomfort. Forced proximity often breeds tension through awkwardness or resistance. This was different. The tension between them was structured, intentional, held in place by mutual restraint rather than unease. It suggested not incompatibility but familiarity. Elizabeth became aware of how naturally her body adjusted in response to Bryan's presence, how her posture aligned unconsciously, how her attention sharpened. It was not attraction in its simplest form. It was recognition layered with memory, now filtered through maturity. Bryan experienced a similar internal recalibration. He was accustomed to control, to managing environments and outcomes. Yet Elizabeth's presence disrupted nothing overtly while altering everything subtly. His awareness sharpened, not as a reflex of desire, but as an acknowledgement of significance. Their proximity intensified without escalation. There were no overt gestures, no deliberate attempts to bridge the distance. Yet each moment sustained the tension, refining it rather than releasing it. It was the kind of restraint that magnifies awareness rather than suppressing it. Richard, observant but discreet, registered the shift without naming it. He did not intervene, nor did he withdraw. He allowed the moment to unfold organically, understanding that interference would only disrupt what was clearly unfolding with its own logic. Elizabeth and Bryan existed within a shared awareness that demanded attention without offering resolution. Their past hovered at the edges of the present, not intruding but informing every silent exchange. What became increasingly clear was that avoidance was no longer possible. Proximity had stripped away distance as a buffer. They were no longer protected by time or separation. They were present, evolved, and fully aware of what recognition had reactivated. The tension was not volatile. It was controlled, deliberate, and layered with restraint that suggested intention rather than fear. Neither was rushing toward resolution. Neither was retreating. This balance, this measured suspension, created its own gravity. Elizabeth understood then that what unsettled her was not the resurgence of feeling, but the clarity with which she now perceived it. There was no confusion, no romanticized uncertainty. What existed between them was grounded, informed by time rather than distorted by it. Bryan recognized the same truth. This was not the ache of unfinished youth resurfacing blindly. This was something recalibrated, refined by distance and growth. Whatever this connection was now, it demanded conscious choice. As the evening progressed, the proximity became less accidental and more sustained. They shared the same physical space without acknowledging the significance of it, yet neither attempted to escape it. The tension held. Not because it had nowhere to go, but because both of them understood, instinctively, that its release would change everything. And neither was prepared to step forward without intention. The separation came quietly, not as an escape but as an inevitability. Proximity had done its work, and the tension it sustained demanded direction. Without coordination or announcement, Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June found themselves removed from the shared space, no longer surrounded by conversation or movement, but positioned within a quieter margin of the evening. The shift was subtle. It did not feel orchestrated, nor did it feel accidental. It felt necessary. The absence of others altered the atmosphere immediately. What had been contained by structure now expanded, not explosively but deliberately. The air between them was no longer buffered by distraction. It held focus, clarity, and the unmistakable weight of attention fully placed. They stood across from each other with the composure of adults who understood the importance of restraint. There was no rush to fill the silence. No urgency to reclaim familiarity. The space between them became a controlled environment, one where intention mattered more than impulse. Elizabeth was the first to register how different this felt from what she had anticipated over the years. She had imagined occasionally what seeing Bryan again might stir: nostalgia, discomfort, perhaps even regret. What she felt instead was clarity. The ache that had once lingered without definition now had structure. It no longer unsettled her. It informed her. Bryan experienced a similar recalibration. The presence of Elizabeth did not destabilize him, it focused him. The discipline he had cultivated over the years did not falter, it sharpened. He understood, with measured certainty, that this moment required honesty without vulnerability masquerading as impulse. Their attention moved slowly, intentionally. They took each other in not as memories, but as realities shaped by time. There was acknowledgement without sentimentality, awareness without assumption. The first exchange between them was restrained, almost formal, yet beneath that control lay depth. They did not revisit the past immediately. They did not apologize, nor did they justify. They spoke from where they stood now, not from where they had once been. That distinction mattered. Elizabeth felt the steadiness in Bryan's presence, the way he engaged without attempting to dominate or retreat. It allowed her to remain grounded, to speak without defense. She was not bracing for disappointment. She was not guarding against loss. She was simply present. Bryan noted the ease with which Elizabeth held herself. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty clouding her attention. She was neither tentative nor guarded. Her confidence was not performative, it was earned. It signaled that she was no longer seeking validation, only truth. As their conversation deepened, the space between them shifted, not physically but emotionally. The distance that had once protected them from complexity now dissolved into awareness. They acknowledged, carefully and without dramatization, that time had passed and growth had occurred. They recognized that neither of them was who they had been, yet neither denied the significance of what had once existed. What emerged was not confession but understanding. Elizabeth understood that Bryan had not left because he lacked feeling. He had left because he lacked readiness. Bryan understood that Elizabeth had not stayed silent because she was indifferent, but because she had respected the limits of what they could be then. There was no resentment in that realization. Only maturity. The silence that followed was not empty. It was reflective, layered with recognition that something long dormant had now been acknowledged without fear. Neither felt the need to resolve everything in that moment. The importance lay in presence, not conclusion. Elizabeth became aware of the subtle shift in her body language, the ease with which she remained open, the absence of tension she had unconsciously expected. Bryan noticed his own restraint transforming into intention. He was not resisting the moment. He was measuring it. This was not a crossing. Not yet. It was alignment. The conversation did not escalate emotionally, yet its impact was undeniable. They had dismantled the illusion that the past was behind them without reopening wounds. They had recognized the connection without exploiting it. What lingered between them afterward was not confusion, but potential. When they eventually re-entered the shared space, something fundamental had changed. The tension remained, but it was no longer unstructured. It had direction now, shaped by acknowledgement and choice rather than avoidance. Elizabeth carried herself with renewed clarity. Bryan moved with quiet resolve. Neither sought to prolong the moment, nor did they retreat from it. They understood that what had been acknowledged could not be unacknowledged. The first private conversation had not answered every question, but it had asked the right ones. And for the first time since their separation, both Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June understood that whatever unfolded next would not be dictated by youth, fear, or unfinished endings. It would be chosen. The evening had shifted, though no one else in the room noticed. For Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June, the air carried a different weight now, one shaped by acknowledgement, awareness, and the invisible gravity that had drawn them together once more. They were adults, deliberate and disciplined, yet the past and the present converged in ways that neither could fully contain. Every gesture was intentional, every glance measured, yet beneath that control flowed an undercurrent that neither of them could, or wanted to, ignore. The restraint they had exercised for years was no longer protective. It had become a frame, holding the tension in place until it could expand into something larger, more complex, and undeniably real. Their proximity had become sustained. Shared glances lingered, shared spaces were occupied without distraction. They were aware of each other in a way that was profound yet silent, intimate without a word being spoken. Every movement, every breath carried recognition. The emotional tension between them was no longer a quiet hum. It had grown into a presence, undeniable and commanding. Elizabeth noticed how easily her body responded, how the simple act of being near Bryan sent currents through her awareness she had thought she had long mastered. It was not desire alone, it was the return of something she had once known and never forgotten, the combination of trust, understanding, and connection. She did not panic. She did not flinch. She simply acknowledged it, allowing the awareness to exist without judgment. Bryan experienced a similar clarity. He felt it in the way his attention narrowed, in the awareness of how every subtle motion of Elizabeth's, her posture, her ease, the way her gaze met his, affected him. It was not impulsive longing. It was recognition, adult and unflinching, of the depth of a connection that had never truly been severed. The first brush of their hands was incidental yet electric. Neither planned it, neither pulled away. The touch was brief, almost casual, but it carried layers of acknowledgement. Years of restraint, of distance, of unspoken understanding, condensed into that single, fleeting contact. Their awareness of each other deepened without dialogue, without confession, without pressure. The emotional line they had maintained for years began to blur. There was no sudden leap, no reckless abandon. Instead, the shift was deliberate, almost imperceptible at first. A subtle leaning closer, a glance that lingered an instant too long, a posture that mirrored the other's movement. Each was a small act that, combined, allowed them to cross a threshold neither had anticipated, yet both recognized the necessity of. Elizabeth's breath hitched once, quietly, subtly. It was a response to the gravity of presence, the weight of attention, and the recognition that what had been deferred for so long was now possible. Bryan felt it too, a tightening, a recognition of what restraint had preserved rather than prevented. The emotional line was no longer abstract, it was tactile, real, and inevitable. The subtle synchronization of their awareness became more pronounced. They adjusted to each other without words, without planning. The tension, once suspended, found its own rhythm. It was no longer a question of if something would happen. It was simply a matter of how, when, and with what acknowledgement. Their eyes met in a long, deliberate exchange. Neither blinked too quickly, neither diverted gaze. In that silent dialogue, every shared memory, every long-suppressed feeling, every nuanced understanding of each other's essence passed without words. It was a crossing that belonged to adults, informed by experience, grounded in self-awareness and conscious in intention. Even as the night continued around them, guests moving, conversations flowing, they existed in a private orbit. The world outside their mutual awareness became background noise, irrelevant to the gravity now in play. They were present fully, deliberately, without hesitation. The emotional line had been crossed, but not recklessly. It was a crossing defined by restraint, by awareness, and by the recognition that the past had prepared them for this moment. They had grown into the kind of people capable of acknowledging intensity without losing themselves, capable of engaging connection without compromising integrity. In that shared awareness, Bryan and Elizabeth discovered not chaos but coherence. Not urgency but intention. Not recklessness but clarity. The emotional line that had separated them in youth had evolved into a bridge, strong, deliberate, and irrevocably charged. And in that bridge, both recognized the truth. What had been deferred was no longer forbidden. It was inevitable. It was real. And it had waited long enough. The night had become theirs, though the world around them remained unchanged. For Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June, proximity was no longer incidental, restraint had transformed into deliberate engagement, and the tension that had lingered for years now had room to breathe and expand. The subtle energy that had drawn them together all evening now pulsed with awareness. Every gesture, every glance, every shared breath carried weight. There was no rush, no desperation, only the deliberate acknowledgement of what had been suppressed and refined over years apart. The unspoken understanding that had existed between them as teenagers now found expression through maturity, through confidence, and through intentionality. Elizabeth noticed the way Bryan observed her, not with idle curiosity, not with a casual glance, but with focus, as though cataloging every nuance she projected. The tilt of her head, the ease in her stance, the controlled grace in her gestures. There was attention without intrusion, desire tempered by patience, and awareness that demanded reciprocity. She recognized it immediately, and her response was measured, conscious, and equally deliberate. Bryan registered the shift in Elizabeth as sharply as she felt him. Her presence was magnetic, yes, but it was the familiarity filtered through time and growth that made it irresistible. He had never experienced attraction that demanded so much attention yet required so little urgency. It was a different kind of power, the kind that made restraint itself feel charged. When their hands brushed, it was no longer incidental. The touch lingered fractionally longer than necessary, deliberate yet subtle. The energy between them shifted, like a current finally allowed to flow without suppression. They were aware of the effect it had on each other, and instead of recoiling, they welcomed it. It was the acknowledgement of years of tension, awareness, and deferred desire finding form. Every shared look became more intentional. Every subtle movement carried an unspoken message: recognition, permission, and willingness. They leaned closer, imperceptibly at first, but with the precision and patience of adults who understood both the gravity and the opportunity of the moment. Neither rushed. Neither forced. They existed within a rhythm of awareness that had been building for years, now permitted to manifest fully. Elizabeth felt the pulse of her own body shift in response to the nearness. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. She breathed deeper, moved with awareness, and allowed herself to inhabit the space fully without fear or hesitation. Bryan mirrored her, his controlled presence softening in a way that was intentional, not impulsive. The tension that had defined their evening until now transformed into something richer, more tangible, a connection both emotional and physical, deliberate yet fluid. Their proximity became choreography, unspoken and effortless. Hands hovered, shoulders brushed, and the smallest movements resonated with awareness. Neither needed to speak. The language had evolved into shared recognition, presence, and deliberate engagement. Every moment carried intention without the need for words, creating a private intimacy within the public space. The air around them thickened, not with urgency but with acknowledgement. The restraint of years dissolved into focused attention, mutual consent implicit in every gesture. The sensuality of the reunion did not come from haste or recklessness, but from deliberate alignment of two people who had grown into themselves and could now recognize and welcome the connection that had waited patiently. Elizabeth allowed herself to lean slightly closer, her awareness tuned to the subtle cues of Bryan's presence. He responded in kind, mirroring her movements with precision and care. Each shift, each fractional adjustment created a rhythm, a dance of attention and awareness that neither initiated nor concluded, but that sustained itself with purpose. The sensuality of the moment was not rushed. It was not loud. It was intimate, deliberate, and fully grounded in the acknowledgement of what had always existed between them. They were not reclaiming teenage curiosity, they were inhabiting an adult connection, fully aware of the past, fully present in the now, fully consenting to the depth of what was unfolding. By the end of the evening, the air between them was charged but controlled, magnetic yet deliberate. They had crossed the threshold from recognition to active engagement, from tension to intimacy, without compromise, without recklessness, and without losing themselves in the process. This was no longer deferred desire. It was intentional, mutual, and fully alive. For the first time in years, Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June were fully aligned, aware, and surrendered to the quiet, potent intimacy that had been waiting patiently for their reunion. The morning light did not rush in, yet it carried the quiet authority of inevitability. After the evening, after recognition, after the careful unfolding of restrained intimacy, Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June were confronted not with uncertainty, but with clarity. The previous night had shifted something fundamental between them, not through impulsive decisions, but through deliberate acknowledgement and mutual presence. They had crossed lines that were once invisible, navigated tension that had defined their shared history, and explored proximity that neither had fully allowed themselves to inhabit before. What had begun as curiosity, evolved into recognition, and matured into measured engagement, now demanded a conscious choice. The past could not dictate their next step. Neither could fear. The responsibility, and privilege, of choice belonged solely to them. Elizabeth reflected on the years spent apart, the relationships that had come and gone, the experiences that had shaped her into the woman she had become. Each encounter, each lesson, each careful act of independence had prepared her for this moment. She realized that the ache she had carried was not a flaw, nor a relic of youth, but a signal, an invitation to act when the timing and readiness aligned. She understood that she could remain cautious, remain composed, or she could choose fully without hesitation. Bryan experienced the same reckoning. Years of self-discipline, years of building a controlled, influential life, had not dulled the significance of Elizabeth's presence. The ache he had long suppressed, the awareness he had learned to temper with logic and ambition, now demanded acknowledgement. He recognized that hesitation was no longer protection, it was avoidance. And avoidance was no longer an option. Their awareness of each other had shifted beyond attraction or nostalgia. It was the culmination of shared history, tempered by growth, and filtered through the lens of adulthood. The choice before them was not impulsive desire. It was recognition of value, compatibility, and readiness. It was an alignment of hearts and minds that demanded action. Neither needed to speak at length. Words, though available, felt almost superfluous. Their eyes met with unspoken agreement. There was no tension now, only purpose. Each understood that commitment, even in its quietest form, required intention. They could no longer rely on circumstances, timing, or passive longing. They had to choose each other fully and consciously. Elizabeth approached the decision not as surrender but as empowerment. She was not giving in. She was not compensating for lost time. She was stepping into the possibility she had always hoped for, grounded in experience and awareness. Choosing Bryan now was not about recapturing the past, it was about embracing the present and committing to the future. Bryan mirrored this clarity. He was not reclaiming youth or correcting mistakes. He was acknowledging what had always mattered, with eyes open to the consequences, responsibilities, and possibilities that came with deliberate choice. His decision was intentional, measured, and unhurried. He understood that the depth of this connection required conscious presence rather than reckless impulse. The alignment between them was quiet but absolute. It existed not as drama, but as a mutual understanding that the moment demanded recognition and action. No one had orchestrated this moment, it had evolved naturally through acknowledgement, attention, and proximity. Yet now it required conscious engagement. In choosing each other, they dismantled years of doubt and distance. They replaced avoidance with presence, hesitation with intention, and suspended longing with deliberate commitment. It was a choice not made lightly, not made for convenience, but made with full awareness of the history, the growth, and the depth of feeling involved. Even the world around them seemed to pause, subtle in its continuity, allowing space for this recalibration. The boundaries of the past, the ache of separation, and the lessons of growth converged to form a foundation upon which they could now build together. They were not the teenagers who had walked away quietly years ago. They were adults, prepared to honor both their past and the potential of the present. By the end of the morning it was clear, hesitation was gone. Doubt was replaced by intention. The choice had been made. Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June were aligned not only by desire or memory, but by conscious, mutual decision. They had chosen each other, this time fully, deliberately, and irrevocably. The world did not change with their choice. The sun rose, people moved through routines, and obligations persisted. Yet for Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June, the universe had subtly shifted, as if the alignment they had reached finally rewrote the contours of their personal existence. What had once been deferred, suppressed, and fragile now existed fully, deliberately, and with intention. The weight of years apart no longer felt like burden, it had become preparation. Every moment of longing, every ache carried silently, every step taken without the other's presence, had refined their awareness and deepened their capacity for connection. That preparation revealed itself now in the clarity with which they inhabited the same space, in the quiet certainty that their union was not merely nostalgic, but profoundly real. Elizabeth moved through the morning with awareness, her steps measured, her presence grounded. She had learned to trust herself, to honor her boundaries, and to embrace her own strength. Now, in alignment with Bryan, she discovered that strength could coexist with intimacy. It could coexist with surrender, not as weakness but as choice. She did not feel the need to protect herself from uncertainty, because this love had already passed every test time had placed before it. Bryan mirrored her equilibrium. The years of self-discipline, control, and meticulously constructed authority had taught him the value of patience, the importance of intent, and the power of presence. He now approached Elizabeth not with urgency, nor with the impulsive abandon of youth, but with deliberate reverence. The love they had deferred was no longer abstract, it was tangible, alive, and shared. Their daily lives began to converge naturally, almost effortlessly. There was no rush to remake the past, no need to recapture lost time. Instead, they built their present on a foundation of acknowledgement, respect, and sustained awareness. The subtlety of everyday gestures, a shared glance across a room, a hand brushed lightly, a quiet conversation over coffee, became the architecture of intimacy. Each moment reinforced their mutual understanding, each interaction confirmed the deliberate choice they had made. Friends like Haley Short and Richard Saint, who had orchestrated proximity without knowing the consequences, continued their presence as subtle support. Their guidance was quiet, non-intrusive, and crucial, providing a framework in which Bryan and Elizabeth could explore their connection safely and intentionally. The private acknowledgement of friends allowed them the freedom to inhabit their union fully, without distraction or external pressure. Sensuality and emotion now flowed together seamlessly. Physical closeness no longer existed in tension with personal growth or emotional awareness. Each touch, each movement, each shared breath reflected understanding rather than impulse, deliberate engagement rather than need. The years of restraint, distance, and emotional negotiation had matured into a connection that was profound, steady, and fully conscious. Elizabeth discovered that vulnerability no longer demanded risk of loss. It demanded presence. She allowed herself to feel completely, without hesitation, without doubt, and without the residual fear of abandonment. Bryan, in turn, discovered that connection did not require suppression of feeling. It required intention, focus, and mutual acknowledgement. The love they had once deferred was now not only allowed but embraced with full awareness. There was no dramatic climax, no overwhelming crescendo, and no theatrical moment of revelation. Theirs was a love that matured quietly, insistently, and deliberately, sustained by history, guided by growth, and validated by conscious choice. They had both changed, evolved, and learned, and the result was a union that honored the entirety of their journey, past, present, and future. Even in moments of silence, their connection was articulate. No words were necessary to communicate the depth of their awareness. Every look, every pause, every touch carried intention. Their love was no longer potential, it was practice, discipline, and presence fully realized. The ache of youth had transformed into the joy of conscious intimacy. The distance they once endured had crystallized into the clarity of choice. The deferred possibilities of adolescence had become fully lived realities. Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June no longer needed time to prove their connection. It was evident, deliberate, and unshakable. Ultimately, their love was not about reclaiming the past. It was about fully inhabiting the present and building deliberately for the future. Years of waiting, reflection, and growth culminated in alignment that was deliberate, conscious, and deeply satisfying. The love that had ended too soon, that had been deferred by circumstance and fear, was now fully realized. Lived deliberately, deliberately cherished, and intentionally sustained. This was not a love of memory or chance. This was a love of choice. And for the first time, Bryan Cool and Elizabeth June knew what it meant to live it completely.